Today, we're taking a deep dive into a massive and honestly almost completely unannounced shift that totally flipped how Americans retire upside down. You see, if you go back to 1980 and you worked for a major American company for 30 years, you were guaranteed something very specific when you retired: a monthly check for the rest of your life. That was the classic American pension. And yet, within just about 2 decades, corporate America made it completely disappear. But it didn't happen through some sweeping national law or a massive public vote. It happened quietly, tucked away in paperwork that, frankly, most workers never fully read. This perfectly illustrates the core of what we're unpacking today. On one hand, we have the historical standard of guaranteed lifetime income. On the other, we have the system most of us are stuck with today, which is essentially a market-dependent bet. In this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how we went from a structurally guaranteed retirement to a high-stakes financial gamble, and what that actually means for the everyday worker. Section 1. The Pension Promise. Okay, so to really grasp what we lost, we've got to look at the exact wording here. Following World War II, pensions became the absolute bedrock of American retirement. But notice the word contract. A pension wasn't just corporate charity, it was a binding agreement. The deal was super straightforward. You work here long enough and we're going to take care of you when you're done. Your monthly check was mathematically calculated using your final salary multiplied by your years of service and a fixed percentage. It was practically a mathematical certainty. Now, the absolutely crucial point is how these mechanics played out in the real world. Think about it. If the stock market completely tanked, well, that was the company's problem, right? Not yours. The company hired the investment pros, they managed the massive funds, and they absorbed all of the risk. All the employee really had to do was show up, put in their years, and provide loyal service. Companies built this incredibly reliable workforce just by making the future feel entirely safe. And the sheer scale of this was just staggering. By 1979, over 28 million American private sector workers were safely covered by these defined benefit pension plans. For 2 whole generations, this worked exactly as intended. Workers retired with predictable, stress-free income. The pension was literally just what you got when you dedicated your working life to an employer. Section 2. The Accidental Loophole. So how did this all fall apart? Well, a perfect storm changed retirement forever, and it actually started back in 1978. Congress passed the Revenue Act. Now, this was mostly just a routine tax bill, but buried deep inside it was a tiny provision that almost nobody paid attention to at the time. Then the 1980s rolled around. This decade brought enormous pressure on companies to cut costs, compete on a global scale, and really maximize shareholder returns. Pensions were incredibly expensive, long-term liabilities just sitting heavy on corporate balance sheets. And this intense economic pressure perfectly collided with that obscure 1978 tax law. That obscure little 1978 provision was called Section 401, subsection K. I absolutely love this quote from our source material because it blows people's minds. The 401k was absolutely never designed to be a national retirement system. Literally, it was just a minor tax dodge for highly paid executives, a perk for the C-suite to lower their tax bill. That was the whole shebang. Which brings us to what's basically a real Trojan horse moment. Enter a benefits consultant named Ted Benna. He was reading through the super dense language of Section 401k and noticed a loophole. The language was actually broad enough to apply to all employees, not just the executives. He realized that if a company just matched contributions, this random, obscure tax perk could function as a savings vehicle for an entire workforce. This was the exact legal exit strategy that corporations who were totally desperate to shed their expensive pension obligations had been searching for. The fallout from this discovery was immediate, but completely invisible. Just 10 years, between 1983 and 1993, pension coverage among private sector workers plummeted from 62% down to just 35%. And remember, there were no big press conferences about this, no massive public announcements. It just happened quietly, one workforce at a time, quietly written into new HR benefits packages that most employees simply signed without ever really understanding what they were permanently giving up. Section 3. Shifting the risk. So, you might be asking, why did companies jump on this so fast? Well, for corporate bottom lines, the 401k was a dream come true because it mechanically shifted the financial responsibility directly onto the shoulders of the individual employee. It completely scrubbed decades-long liabilities right off their corporate balance sheets. In a flash, the company's obligation shrank from a guaranteed lifetime of income down to a simple matching contribution. And honestly, sometimes they didn't even have to offer a match. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, why didn't workers just revolt right then and there? Well, it mostly comes down to this number. 400%. For a good while, nobody really questioned the shift because the 1990s delivered the longest bull market in American history. The S&P 500 returned over 400% in that decade alone. Workers transitioning into 401ks were opening their mail, seeing their account balances skyrocketing, and feeling incredibly wealthy. Because let's be honest, nobody asks if a building's foundation is structurally sound while they're throwing a massive party on the roof. The numbers just kept going up. But then, came the plot twist. The dot-com collapse in 2000, and in the massive global financial crisis in 2008. Workers who are maybe just 5 years away from retirement watched in horror as 30 to 40% of their life savings simply evaporated in a matter of months. To really grasp what shifting the risk means in the real world, just contrast the lived experiences of these two workers during that 2008 crash. The worker with a traditional pension, they simply collected their monthly check right through the entire global meltdown. The market crash literally wasn't their problem. But the worker with a 401k had zero protection. Their entire retirement was directly tied to the exact same markets that had just cratered. Millions of people discovered the brutal difference between a promise and a bet years too late to actually do anything about it. Section 4. The hidden costs. Here's the thing about the 401k. It didn't just dump the risk onto your shoulders. It also built this permanent, essentially mandatory pipeline of paycheck money straight into Wall Street. Think about it. Pre-401k, pension funds were managed by a relatively small number of highly negotiated, tough institutional investors. But post-401k, tens of millions of individual Americans were suddenly automatically funneling a chunk of every single paycheck directly into mutual funds, funds managed by Wall Street firms who were legally allowed to collect fees on every single dollar. And what's honestly mind-blowing is how these fees compound over time. A 1% annual management fee. That sounds incredibly tiny, right? Almost small enough to just ignore. But over a 40-year career, that invisible little fee can consume up to 28% of a worker's total potential returns. That is over a quarter of the wealth they generated, just gone. And most workers have absolutely no idea they're even paying it, because it almost never shows up as a line item. It's simply shaved off the fund's growth before you ever even open your statement. Section 5. The retirement reality. Okay, so we've covered the history and the math. Let's fast forward to right now. Wall Street obviously had every incentive in the world to push 401ks into law, and the lobbying power to make sure the rules stayed highly favorable to them once they were established. Today, total 401k assets in the United States sit at over $7 trillion. It has been an unbelievable, totally unprecedented victory for the financial services industry, locking in massive amounts of assets under management. But we've got to juxtapose that massive mountain of Wall Street wealth with a pretty sobering reality on the ground. Right now, roughly 57 million Americans have absolutely zero retirement savings. None at all. Sure, the American worker received a tax-advantaged savings account, but they also receive a level of incredibly complex financial responsibility they never asked for and frankly were rarely ever equipped to handle. And what about the folks who actually do have 401k savings? Well, let's lay out the grim math. For workers getting close to retirement age, say 55 to 64 years old, the median 401k balance is around $87,000. If you apply a standard 4% annual withdrawal rate to make sure that money lasts, that yields roughly $290 a month in income. Think about that compared to a guaranteed pension. This dynamic practically forces Social Security to be the primary income source for millions of people, even though Social Security was originally designed only to be a supplement to those private pensions that just don't exist anymore. So the absolutely crucial takeaway from all our source material is basically perfectly crystallized right here. The pension did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it was expensive for the people writing the checks. What replaced it was a whole lot cheaper for corporations, immensely more profitable for Wall Street, and wildly riskier for the workers. This entire structural shift was not an accident, guys. It was a deliberate policy decision made over decades. Understanding this history is really the very first step to understanding what the American retirement system actually is today and who it was truly designed to benefit. Which leaves us with a pretty massive, critical question to wrap things up today. You're sending this money off every 2 weeks, but where does your 401k money actually go once it leaves your paycheck? Who is holding on to it, and what exactly are they doing with it? Think about that as you review your own financial setup, and we're going to unpack exactly that in our next Explain.